We're now joined by James Oakes. He is Distinguished Professor of History at the CUNY Graduate Center and the author of several influential books on the history of the United States from the Revolution through the Civil War, including The Radical and the Republican, Freedom National, The Scorpion's Sting, and his most recent, The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln, and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. Jim, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you are, of course, a historian of slavery, emancipation, and the Civil War, among other events in U.S. history. And we will definitely get to all of those topics in a little bit. But I wanted to kick off by asking you about the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which, of course, has been the subject of a lot of robust public debate over the last, 2 years since it came out in 2019. And you were one of 5 signatories on a letter to the New York Times kind of at the start of the debate, which sort of kicked off a lot of the discussion. And I wanted to ask you about that in particular because one of your co-signatories, Sean Wilentz, recently had a great longer piece kind of discussing, some of his misgivings and concerns about the 1619 Project. And in that piece, he talked about how quite a few historians had actually been approached to assess the project and respond to it and critique it. But a lot of the historians who were approached to sign on to the letter, said something along the lines of, well, I agree with your concerns or I have issues with the 1619 Project as well, but I'm not ready to put my name to an open letter because, of X, Y, or Z political considerations, or because I think a lot of the historians, that Wilentz mentioned, said something along the lines of like, well, I'm not so sure about some of the claims made by the 1619 Project, but it's a really important cultural event, and I don't want to be seen as, impugning the work of Black journalists, all of which I think, are legitimate and fair concerns. So just by way of beginning, can you talk a little bit about why you chose to sign the open letter to the New York Times and what kind of your main concerns with the 1619 Project are?
Wow, that's a big question. I signed the letter basically because it focused narrowly on some fairly egregious factual errors in the mostly in the introduction to the project. But my concern about factual errors lay elsewhere outside of the purview of that particular letter. They were focused primarily on the question of the relationship between slavery and the American Revolution, which the 1619 Project not only gets wrong, it gets it backward. That is, we've known for decades that the central significance of the American Revolution to the history of slavery, and New World slavery in particular, was that it was the beginning of anti-slavery politics. It was the first time you got abolition on a significant scale, and it went through one state after another, and the accumulation of those states that abolished slavery, inspired by the Revolution, is what we call the North, and it's impossible to imagine American history from the Revolution to the Civil War without a North and a South in conflict with one another, repeatedly, ultimately to the point where the whole country collapses into civil war. So to get it, it's one thing to say they made a mistake when they said it was that pro-slavery defense was a primary reason for declaring your independence. It's not only was it not a primary reason, it was virtually no reason, but it as I said, it gets backwards the actual historical significance of the American Revolution for the history of slavery and anti-slavery in particular. And, that is an indication of a larger problem throughout the 1619 Project, which is that it erases substantial conflicts throughout U.S. history over slavery and racism in the United States. And it does that, I think, primarily, well, for 2 reasons. First, because it's written from a vaguely Black nationalist perspective that seeks to argue that any progress African Americans have ever made, they've made largely on their own. There's no such thing as white abolitionists. There's no such thing as a Republican Party. There was no such thing as a civil rights movement that attracted millions of whites as well as blacks. So it's erasing a history of conflict over those issues throughout American history because of that perspective, and that distorts. And the second source of its distortion was that it was written with the goal of justifying reparations. And that distorts the way they approach history too, because it not only erases white allies from the history of Black freedom struggles, it makes all whites responsible for the various forms of oppression African Americans have suffered through the centuries, the very real oppression they've suffered. And in order to do that, in a way that I don't quite understand, the supporters of reparations seem to feel the need to argue that all white people were enriched by the oppression of blacks. And this goes flat up against a well-known understanding that slave economies inhibit economic development, restrict opportunities for whites living in the proximity of slave economies, and consigned generations of whites as well as blacks to poverty and misery. And it seems to me that a better case for reparations would be a more truthful account of the disastrous consequences of the slave economy for the United States and for the southern United States in particular. So I was particularly concerned with the factual errors in the essay by Matthew Desmond, which was all about the relationship between slavery and capitalism, and like the argument about the American Revolution, gets that relationship exactly backwards. That is, it wants to claim that all of Northern wealth was based on slavery, when it's a much stronger case to say that the entire slave economy was based on the enormous wealth and consumer demand emanating from the more advanced economies and more developed economies in England and the North at the time. There is a powerful relationship between capitalism and slavery, but it's the reverse of the one, it's close to being the reverse of the one that's posited by that essay and by the 1619 Project. So it's not just a question of getting your facts wrong, it's getting them wrong in a way that reverses some of the major findings of historians over the past several generations.
That's a perfect segue into my next question, because I was going to ask you specifically about the Desmond essay, and you answered kind of part of what I wanted to ask.
Okay.
But I suppose a follow-up to that is, what is a better way of understanding the relationship between slavery and capitalism, or the development of American capitalism? Because, you just alluded to it being very important to the development of capitalism, but not in the way that Desmond lays out. So what is a better way of understanding it?
Well, to take off, it's a global issue rather than a U.S. issue. So the way capitalism and slavery operates in the United States is not quite the same, is slightly a different story from the way the relationship developed over the centuries in the Atlantic economy. So you could say we have three distinct phases in a sense. The first, slavery by the imperial powers of Portugal and Spain that inaugurate the Atlantic slave trade and bring large numbers of slaves to the Caribbean and South America, did not benefit from that development because those economies at home were backward, those were extensions of the feudal system of expansion. So after 1.5 centuries of development of activity, intense activity in the Atlantic world, the result for Spain and Portugal was economically nil in terms of its economic development. It's only when Great Britain, and to some extent the Netherlands, get involved in the slave trade, particularly in the 18th century, that you begin to see a connection between the development of capitalism and the Atlantic slave trading world. And there is pretty much a consensus among historians and economic historians who spent decades going over this, that the slave trade contributed something to the industrial development of Great Britain, but that it probably would have happened otherwise. That is, it would have gone slower. It might have taken a slightly different form. But here's the point. You see, coming from the perspective I come from, the great debates over the transition from feudalism to capitalism that formed my understanding of this whole issue taught me that capitalism developed prior to industrialization, and it was the prior development of capitalism, particularly in England and Great Britain, but mostly in England, that led to the development of England's involvement and deep engagement in the slave trade. Right? So in that sense, capitalism precedes Britain's major involvement in the slave trade and gives rise to both New World slave economies in the Anglo-American world and industrialization. So the development of capitalism is prior to both industrialization and British involvement in the slave trade. And then comes the United States. In the United States, the story is slightly different because industrialization doesn't happen in a significant way until the 19th century, after a century or more of having slaves in the southern colonies in particular, but every colony had slavery. And there it seems to me that it's the development of an extraordinary explosion of consumer demand emanating from the capitalist world for textiles, cotton, the goods, or, tobacco, rice, sugar, coffee. It's the consumer demand from an already developing capitalist world that is giving life and breathing new life into the slave economy. Some people call that what happened in the United States in the 19th century a second slavery, but I tend to think of it as a third slavery after the Portuguese and Spanish slavery. After the 18th century British Anglo-American slavery comes a third cotton economy that's located primarily in the American South, but again is driven by the development of capitalism. So, for example, the first textile mills go up in Rhode Island, Slater's Mills, before there is a cotton gin. It is the existence of those mills and the demand coming from the nascent northern industrial economy that causes Southerners to say, we got to figure out some way of producing our cotton more efficiently. And it's Eli Whitney comes down and produces it, but his cotton gin is patented 2 years or something like that after Slater's Mills go up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So the relationship between capitalism and slavery is very powerful, but it varies over time, and it's mostly, by the 19th century, the capitalist economy that is driving the prosperity of the slave economies.
And so you've been very critical of a tendency that you call racial consensus history, and I think you could arguably describe the 1619 Project as that. So can you explain what you mean by racial consensus history, and why is that a problem to you?
Well, it's something I did allude to in my first answer. It's the assumption that there is no conflict among whites over issues like race and slavery in the United States, which leaves us with no explanation for why slavery was abolished in the northern states after the American Revolution, why a civil war erupted over slavery. We all agree that it was caused by slavery, and why hundreds of thousands of whites were killing one another in a war that became a revolutionary war to overthrow slavery. Where does the 14th Amendment come from? Where does the 15th Amendment come from? There is abundant evidence, and we saw it last year when tens of thousands of whites marched into the streets in the middle of a pandemic to protest the outrageous murder of George Floyd. There have always been large numbers of whites divided amongst themselves in alliance with blacks and in a struggle against slavery and racial discrimination in the United States. And the 1619 Project erases that and instead posits a racial consensus among whites that is unchanging. And it uses biological metaphors to posit, or even biblical metaphors, right? That racism is, when you say racism is built into the DNA of the United States, or that it's America's original sin, those things are unchanging. DNA passes down through the generations, and original sin is reborn with every new generation, right? And it's designed to show an unchanging white racial consensus. And that to me is not just, ahistorical. It's almost anti-historical. It's not the biological metaphor that's the problem. It's specifically the DNA metaphor. So we use metaphors all the time that are biological, like we say the mother country, or generations, the generation of World War of 1917 or something like that, and the 60s generation. And it's all they're designed to show the historical specificity of a particular moment as it was differentiated from a previous moment or from what came after. But when you say DNA or original sin, it's used in particular in the 1619 Project and elsewhere. It's designed to show something that doesn't change, a white racial consensus that's born with the United States and is with us still. So that it will not differentiate between a slave picking cotton on a Mississippi plantation in the 1850s and a tenured professor at Harvard, who, if they're both black, they're both subjected to exactly the same same white racial consensus, and nothing has fundamentally altered that. And that seems to me to be, unhelpful as a way of figuring out where we are right now and what kind of politics we need at this moment.
And I want to get to the anti-slavery movement, but what you just said made me think, because even among establishment Democrats today, they often kind of use this framing of original sin in our DNA, and it kind of begs the question, if it's that hopeless,
exactly,
why vote for whatever Democratic candidate that is saying this, trying to get our vote? It's kind of ironic in that way.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier about the nationalist assumption that we're never going to get anything from white allies, so we're going to have to do this on our own. And that seems to me the logical politics that comes out of the assumption of a white racial consensus, an unchanging white racial consensus. Yes, the paradox is that if you actually believe that, as you said, then why have any politics? Right. If it hasn't changed over the course of 250 years, what makes you think you can do anything now? What makes you think hiring Robin DiAngelo to teach you to be an anti-racist is going to somehow change what a fundamental structural transformation, like the overthrow of the largest, wealthiest slave economy on earth, didn't change, right? If that's not enough to cause people to change, then seminars isn't going to do it either.
Well, on that point, maybe the opposite of Robin DiAngelo, the anti-slavery movement, which I think is one of this country's most powerful mass movements in our history. Generally, what do you think the left can kind of learn today from that? Obviously, a very different time period, different movement, but just like the way that movement had an impact on U.S. politics. What can we kind of take from that today?
I think it's this is a lesson I've come to very slowly after years of studying it, and basically has to do with coalition building. Right? It's notorious, it's famous, it's accepted by all historians that the Republican Party in the 1850s was a kind of unwieldy coalition between diverse, often contradictory elements, and yet it succeeds. And I think watching how you build that kind of coalition among people who might disagree about a lot of other things, disagree about internal improvements, disagree about immigration, disagree about all sorts of things, if you can find a way of marshaling an underlying anti-slavery animus and tacking it to a particular policy, in this case, preventing slavery from expanding into the Western territories. It's possible to build out of these discordant elements a viable political coalition. But it's beyond that. It's beyond that because even a political coalition like that, once you get to civil war, right, they need to go beyond a Republican Party coalition. So the Lincoln and the Republicans are quite conscious that they're going to have to get the votes of war Democrats, right, who may be hostile to emancipation, but will stay with it if they can be persuaded, say, that this is a war primarily to restore the Union, and we're willing to swallow ultimately the Emancipation Proclamation and even the 13th Amendment, as long as we restore the Union. So you find another way of holding that coalition together. And it goes beyond that too, because the coalition, the political coalitions have to be sustained by larger social coalitions. So that Republican coalition comes to rely on a number of populations that are outside of formal politics. Large numbers of women, for example, contribute to the war effort in a variety of different ways. For example, the Republicans place a great deal of faith and hope in the non-slave holders of the South. Right? They are initially very reluctant to secede. There are enough non-slave holders in the upper South to prevent those states from joining the Confederacy, which is a devastating blow to the Confederacy right from the start. They just assumed that every slave state would join them, but the slaveholders in those states cannot get the non-slave holders on board. There's a good deal of evidence that they were reluctant secessionists, and we know that over the course of the war, they were the first to abandon the Confederacy, and by the last year of the war, they are massive defections from the Confederate Army from those. But the biggest, most important group outside of formal politics that becomes part of the tacit Republican coalition are the slaves themselves. It becomes very clear from the very earliest weeks of the war that the slaves understood this war to be about their own freedom, their own emancipation. And by the end of the first year of the war, Republicans are saying very clearly, based on letters coming back to their families from the South, from soldiers in the South, from Union officials in the South, writing to Washington officials, the only reliably loyal people we are encountering in the South are the slave population. And in formal political terms, loyalty begets an obligation to protect on the part of the state. And to a large extent, it's the loyalty versus disloyalty issue that is always determining the fate of emancipation. And it became very clear very early on that the slaves were an indispensable loyal part of the coalition of the loyal. And so when you listen to Republicans like William Seward talk about this coalition, they say this is a fight between slaveholders and non-slaveholders. And the non-slaveholders include all of those people I mentioned. It includes the slaves. It includes women. It includes Democrats. It includes, everybody inside and outside the coalition. So that's the lesson I took from it, that don't be so picky about the ideological purity of the people inside your coalition. Just keep your eye on the prize. Know what it is that this is all about. This is fundamentally about the slavery and the destruction of slavery, and do what you need to do to keep that coalition together. Because if you can't do that, you're not going to get anything.
I want to follow up on that by asking one pretty basic question about the anti-slavery movement, which is, how big was it? Because I think that, sometimes in the popular imaginary, there's this idea that the abolitionists were like a pretty small kind of moral vanguard. But I think something that's interesting about what you just said and about your writing in general is that you make it clear that this is a mass movement, and that, took many years of kind of different groups, not just coming together, but actively, as you were saying, doing politics together. And as you just said, like, the coalition was at times fragile. So first of all, how big was it? And then the other question I have, just following from your point about kind of maybe throwing ideological purity like by the wayside at some times, something you've written about for Jacobin before is this idea that we see coming from some quarters of the left that, like, well, white abolitionists were actually just racist anyway, or like, this idea that, like, well, Abraham Lincoln, like, sure, the Emancipation Proclamation, but like secretly or like deep down, he was a racist. How how do we make sense of that charge? I don't find it satisfying. But
it's completely unsatisfying because it's based in an idealist conception of history that fails to step back and look at the structural situation that people are in. So you have a situation, let's take the Mississippi Valley during the Civil War, where some of the most violent versions of emancipation are taking place. These are huge plantation districts that are overrun by Union forces relatively early in the war. And what you see is a very violent process, often by which the Union Army is literally tearing up the slave system in this extremely wealthy part of the plantation South. Well, the point is that the Union Army is the revolutionary force, or one of the two major revolutionary forces, in conjunction with the slaves themselves in the South. And there is too much focus on the ideological inadequacies of some of the people who are in the Union Army. Right? Some of them are racist. Some of them do nasty things to the people they are in the process of liberating. And it's very important to step back and look at this as a structural transformation that doesn't depend on the ideological orientation of individual soldiers. Let me give you a very specific example. Historians of emancipation during the Civil War rather like John C. Fremont. He was the Republican Party candidate in 1856, and he famously declared the emancipation of slaves very early in Missouri during the Civil War. But he was told by Lincoln to rewrite his order, and then he was fired. Something like that. He was fired because he was incompetent as a general. Right? Mostly because he was just not a competent general. Now, if you, by comparison, you take someone like William Tecumseh Sherman, who, unlike Fremont, doesn't have very strong anti-slavery convictions, is kind of racist, but is a very competent general. Now, if you step back and say the Union Army is the force that is digging up slavery wherever it goes, then what you want to destroy slavery are competent generals. Right? So William Tecumseh Sherman is a much better emancipationist than John C. Fremont ever was, because he was totally incompetent as both an emancipationist and a general. Right? So you need to step back and see the degree to which that the quality of an emancipationist does not depend on how they feel about black people. It depends on whether they are participating actively and effectively in the destruction of slavery. And I think, and I think it's that idealism that has taken a hold. I don't want to say it doesn't matter what individual soldiers feel, but you need to step back and accept that it's without a Union Army and without the successful defeat of the Confederacy on the battlefield, you're not going to get emancipation. There is no emancipation. And it's not as though it's a normal thing in wars for armies to go around emancipating slaves. It's actually quite the opposite. The normal kind of thing that happens as wars is what the Confederate Army did. They go into Pennsylvania and they round up blacks and enslave them. When they take over areas in the Mississippi Valley that had been occupied by the Union forces, they re-enslave massive numbers of blacks. That's what armies tend to do throughout human history. They enslave. Why is the Union Army not enslaving? Well, there's a policy coming out of Washington telling them not to, telling them to do the opposite, right? So if you don't step back and look at the political, stakes that are being fought out and the policies that are coming out of Washington and what the Union Army is actually there to do, then it seems to me if you're going to reduce it to how nice this individual soldiers feel about black people, you're never gonna understand what's going on.
So I want to just quickly jump back to the first part of my question, which is how big can we say the anti-slavery movement was? And let's not include the Union Army for this. And I know, it's kind of It's kind of like a vague question, or, obviously we can't put an exact number on it, but if we look at, groups and anti-slavery publications and, whatever else we can define within the scope of the movement. I mean, just to get a size, because we were talking about it being a mass movement rather than like a committed vanguard, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The Republican Party is an anti-slavery party. And it wins a majority of the votes in the North. So you can say with some certainty that a majority of Northerners by 1860 are committed to anti-slavery politics, right? The Confederates used to justify secession in part by claiming that and complaining that a whole generation of Northerners were raised on anti-slavery anti-slavery school books. They listened to anti-slavery sermons in their churches. Their parents were anti-slavery. That a whole generation of Northerners had grown up thinking in pro-slavery, in anti-slavery terms. And I think that's basically accurate. I used to have exactly the opposite problem when I was teaching Southern history. I would try to get students to not be so censorious or not assume a kind of moral high ground about Southerners because they had grown up in a world that accepted slavery, and that the world had accepted slavery for thousands of years, right? So yes, they're on the wrong side, but you could have easily been on the wrong side. And that's one of the things Abraham Lincoln used to say. If I was born in the South, I would probably be pro-slavery, just like most Southerners are. But I was born I wasn't born in the North, actually. I grew up in the North. I accepted the principles of my Northern education. But my parents were anti-slavery. They went to an anti-slavery church. So I can't remember a time when I wasn't anti-slavery. And I think probably the majority of Northerners felt the same way. You couldn't get a Northerner to argue that slavery was a constitutionally protected right of property. Even the Democrats couldn't bring themselves to say that because they wouldn't get elected. So if you think in those terms, this is where Matt Karp is right. We're talking about millions of abolitionists. Millions of people vote for someone who has explicitly said, I am committed to putting slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. Right? And if you don't take that seriously, you say, oh, but look at the way he planned to do it. It wasn't going to work. It wasn't, all right, it's a revolutionary transformation in not just U.S. history, but in global history, really.
And to go back to William T. Sherman as an abolitionist, I got to say a really funny image just popped in my head of Sherman in a white fragility session with Robin DiAngelo. Gave me a pretty good laugh. But,
right.
I mean,
maybe he should have.
He's horrible about slavery, and there's a notorious incident where during the famous march from Atlanta to the sea, where a number of enslaved people run to his lines, and one of his commanders pulls up the bridges, and they're stuck on the other side of the river, and the slaveholders come after them and do horrible things to them, and he's more or less indifferent to the immediate suffering of those people. But he is destroying slavery more effectively than almost any Union commander, except maybe Grant.
Yeah, and what's frustrating about this is, none of what you just said to me is denying any agency to African Americans or enslaved people. And like you said, I mean, enslaved people fully understood throughout this whole process that this had to do with them, and they, of course, acted that way. But, there's nothing denying agency to say that other groups were being active too. You know what I mean?
No. One of the first things I ever published as a young historian, as a young scholar, was an essay on the political significance of slave resistance. And all that's happened in the 30, 40 years since I wrote that and published that is affirmed my belief and deepened my conviction that you cannot understand emancipation outside of the agency of the slaves. Moreover, the big surprise to me when I switched from studying slavery to anti-slavery politics was the realization that the Republicans understood that as well. But they knew that for emancipation to work, significant numbers of slaves had to run to Union lines and undermine the slave system from within. Ultimately, significant numbers of enslaved men had to join the Union Army and become 1/5 of the Union Army by the last year of the war. right? So the Republicans knew that the agency of the slaves was a central part of the process they were embarked on.
And this is kind of a good lead into what might be our last question. And, as a former history public school teacher, I definitely care about this one. A lot of the right-wing attack on the 1619 Project, which, to be clear, is not the attack you're doing, but from the right wing, a lot of it has now transformed into how do we teach history in our schools, critical race theory, all these things are kind of melding together. So, how do you think public schools should teach the history of slavery and Civil War in the United States?
Teach the conflict. Just don't lose sight of the conflict. Really, that's what bothers me about the Matthew Desmond essay. That's what bothers me about so much of the recent scholarship is that it erases the conflict that's always been there. And without conflict, there is no history. It is driven by conflict. Seems to me.
I think I have actually just one more last question, kind of maybe to go back to the sort of initial question about the 1619 Project. So I think, something people obviously find this idea that you can trace a sort of unbroken string from slavery to the oppressions or the inequalities of modern day very compelling, right? And just by way of anecdote, a few years ago when we started hearing this, I guess, narrative that modern policing evolved out of slave patrols, I actually wrote to a historian of policing. James, I'm gonna ask you about that too. But I wrote to a historian of policing, and I was like, can you recommend some reading on this particular question? Because I don't know. I have questions and I'm not really sure about the veracity of this, right? And the historian, who of course I'm not going to name here, was very kind and thoughtful, and was basically this is a very hard claim to sustain empirically, but I'm reticent to come out swinging against it because people find it so compelling. So AKA what the historians who didn't want to sign the letter to the New York Times about the 1619 Project, a variation of kind of that sentiment, right? So two questions for you. One, did policing evolve out of slave patrols, since you are a historian of that time period? And I really would like to finally get an answer on record. And then B, I guess, again, because people find kind of these metaphors or these linkages so compelling, is there a political utility to, I don't know, kind of maybe fudging the facts, or maybe there's a more diplomatic way of putting it, but...
Well, I'm not a historian of policing, but my impression has always been, let's narrow the question down to when do you get police forces? Because it's when we say things like defund the police, we're talking about defunding more or less urban police forces. And you don't get urban police forces. Urban police forces are a function of urbanization, and you don't get much urbanization in slave economies. So you first see it in Boston and Philadelphia and New York and like that. And it's structurally, it has always tended to be a rather reactionary force. It's there to uphold the order as it exists, and if the order is inequitable and unjust, police are going to uphold. So a lot of it was originally suppress immigrants, suppress workers, things like that. But the police forces we live with today have, as far as I know, have their origins there, not in slave patrols. I wrote 2 books about slavery. I take the history of slavery very seriously, but I don't think that we need to go back to slavery to justify policies designed to counteract mass incarceration, because mass incarceration doesn't come out of slavery. It comes out of the 1980s and 90s. And that's where you start to see massive increases in incarceration rates. And it seems to me that the slavery, On one hand, it's a truism. Everything in the past produces everything in the future, right? So yeah, slavery is part of our past. But it seems to me that the specific problems we face right now have more specific origins, and it doesn't help me to tie mass incarceration to slavery. It's more helpful to me to tie it to Clinton and to neoliberalism and to what happened to the Democratic Party and why that has to be dealt with now as a problem, right? And the same with the massive inequality that has emerged in the United States and reached record levels starting in 1970. Starting in the 1970s, that's a problem we are living with right now. If you want to tie it back to Jim Crow or to slavery, I don't find that particularly helpful because it's the policy reversals that emerged starting in the 1960s, the decision not to tax rich people at the levels they had been taxed at, not to tax corporations, not to, a whole series of policies that were implemented that have resulted in this dramatic increase in inequality and economic injustice that is a threat to democracy right now. And, I don't see it doesn't help me figure out what needs to be done right now to tell me that its origins are in slavery or racism or something like that, or Jim Crow. I just don't see that that's helpful. And it's not because I'm someone who doesn't care about that history. I've devoted my life to that history. It just doesn't seem to me to be helpful right now. The kinds of stuff you learn from history are the more general stuff that I was mentioning earlier. The importance of coalition building, the not worrying too much about the ideological purity of the coalition, so long as the policy is clearly understood and what needs to be done. So, the populists of the late 19th century, of the 1890s, for example, the Colored Farmers Alliance and the Farmers Alliance threaten the power of the landlord class that had emerged as very powerful. And the landlord class fights back and destroys so much of what had been achieved in Reconstruction and massive disfranchisement that results in the disfranchisement not simply of most blacks, but of a substantial number of poor whites, because that potential coalition is so threatening to the ruling class that had emerged in the South in the late 19th century. And it doesn't help understand what was going on to say, but look how racist so many of those white farmers were. Yeah, they were, but they had class interests that could potentially, if they unified, seriously threaten the powers that be, the ruling class. And I think those are the kind of lessons we need to care about. Whereas, again, seminars on how to be an anti-racist don't help. They don't help. They probably do more damage, I can't tell you how many people I know, even in my own family, who voted for Trump, and have a deep abiding resentment of the coastal elites who continually refer to them as racists. And I know these people because they're in my family, because they're not racists, that they can't stand being called racists. And I watched Ted Cruz 2 days ago interrogating a group of witnesses before a congressional committee about whether or not the voter ID laws were racist. And the 3 Democrats all said they're racist, and 2 others said they weren't racist. And he just skewered the Democrats, because they should have said, no, they're not explicitly racist. They're part of a Republican Party project that goes back decades, designed to overthrow democracy in a variety of different ways. It's a power grab, right? And he could get them on the racism charge, but if they turned it around and said, you guys are systematically, reapportioning legislatures so that the Republicans will stay in control and Democrats lose. You're systematically reapportioning congressional districts. You're taking over the judiciary. You're doing everything you can to ensure that your party wins permanently, and the Democrats lose. And part of that is voter ID laws and a whole bunch of things that will disproportionately affect blacks, but are basically part of a much larger power grab. The racism argument isn't, it's not going to work if you see what the Republican Party has been up to for the last 40 years. What do they think the Federalist Society comes from?
I think a lot about how Eric Foner always sort of famously identifies Reconstruction as like a really important time period that the left should study, in terms of like thinking about coalition building, as you were talking about, and also political strategy. So just, again, to kind of go back to your comments on coalition building. I just personally find that a much more useful way of recalling history or like finding historical analogs than to just say that, everything can be traced back to slavery or Jim Crow. So,
or racism.
Or right, exactly. Or a a kind of trans historical racism or something.
To go back to where we started, one of my colleagues, a fine historian of early American history named David Waldstreicher, has wrote in his very first book that the American Revolution did not invent racism. Racism had existed for quite some time. What the American Revolution actually invented was anti-racism. And he's repeating that in a new book he's about to publish. There's a history of anti-racism. When we study the history of racial ideology, we tend to study the racists. We don't study the anti-racists. And we're mostly looking at the anti-racists for the inadequacies of their anti-racism. Right? But, they're not anti-racist the way I think we should be anti-racist, therefore they're racist. Well, you have to study that as a part of the history too, because it's there. It's there. There's a conflict.
I think that is the perfect note to end on, because we have kept you a little bit past the time we said we would. So again, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. James Oakes, again, his latest book, The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.